Good afternoon. I am Kristen Kingsley, founder of K. Kingsley Consulting Auto Safety Strategies. On behalf of the Lifesavers Planning Committee, welcome to the closing plenary of this 39th annual, our first ever virtual conference. I am honored to serve as your MC and hope you enjoyed the conference, got the chance to network in our virtual networking and exhibit halls, and imagined yourself taking breaks between sessions in warm and sunny California. I'm happy to report that this year's conference had around 1,500 registrants from all 50 states, several territories, and multiple countries. Over the past 3 days, you have had the opportunity to learn about the latest research, new programs, services, and technology, and been given tools and strategies to combat risky driving behaviors amidst the COVID pandemic and other social issues we are currently facing. Hopefully, you were able to catch up with longtime safety colleagues and friends and make some new ones. Maybe you won one of our daily prizes. If so, congratulations. Our peer exchanges were a brand new component of the conference this year. If you participated in these lively discussions about current traffic safety issues, we hope that you will use key takeaways from these discussions to bring back to your community. We also encourage you to consider these topics when submitting proposals for next year's conference. I hope you were able to spend some time in our virtual exhibit hall to peruse the latest and greatest regarding programs, technology, and all things traffic safety. On behalf of the Lifesavers Planning Committee, once again, I would like to thank our generous sponsors. Without them, we could not bring you this wonderful annual gathering, the largest gathering of highway safety professionals in the United States. I would like to remind everyone about the post-conference sessions with 3 of our sponsors. On Thursday, April 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, the National Safety Council will host a session on Check to Protect. On the 29th, also at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, Toyota Buckle Up for Life. We also have a session from General Motors, where you can find more information on these sponsor safety outreach presentations on the website under auxiliary trainings. During Monday's opening plenary session, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and current social issues on traffic safety took center stage. Our speakers shared some of the challenges they are facing as law enforcement, public health, and traffic safety professionals, and offered potential solutions and strategies to overcome these challenges. These issues have impacted all of us. We are all learning new ways to engage in even the simplest daily tasks. How many of you ever thought you would be part-time teachers for your children at home while juggling responsibilities at work? The last few years have been trending in the right direction for overall fatalities and crashes, although we have seen increases in speeding and pedestrian and cyclist crashes. The COVID pandemic has further increased these incidents, and we seem to have lost some ground in 2020 regarding impaired and distracted driving. We are hopeful for a better, healthier, and safer future, but we need to work together to build it. Regardless of where you live and work, we can all find commonalities in the strategies, countermeasures, policies, and other mitigation efforts that have been presented to us over the last few days. As vehicle technologies become more widely available, we can inform ourselves and our communities about their life-saving potential, while also highlighting the distinction between driver assist systems and automated driving. When used properly, vehicle-based countermeasures can reduce the likelihood of a crash and mitigate the severity of those that are unavoidable. After participating in our workshops over the past 3 days and hearing from subject matter experts in the field, I am sure that you can identify elements and strategies from these workshops to leverage ways to keep your communities safe during these challenging times, when taking a walk or a bike ride, when traveling to school, or any time we travel on our roadways. Our next speaker will likely give you a few more. We are honored to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Jewel Mullen. Dr. Mullen is Associate Dean for Health Equity at Dell Medical School, as well as an Associate Professor in the school's Population Health and Internal Medicine departments. She also serves as Director of Health Equity at Ascension Seton to help meet health equity goals across its system. Dr. Mullen is an internist, epidemiologist, public health expert, and the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. While at HHS, she also served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Health and Acting Director of the National Vaccine Program Office during the months bridging the transition from the Obama to the Trump administrations. Prior to her time at HHS, Mullen served for 5 years as Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Public Health. As Connecticut's Public Health Commissioner, Dr. Mullen created an Office of Health Equity Research, Evaluation, and Policy to ensure that reducing disparities was included as a deliberate, measurable outcome of the department's programmatic and regulatory efforts. She also successfully spearheaded initiatives to reduce racial disparities in low birth weight and infant mortality. As commissioner, she directed her agency's response to events such as natural disasters, the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and infectious disease outbreaks such as Ebola. Her accomplishments at HHS included participation in the coordination of the federal public health response to Zika, working closely with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, other federal partners, and leaders in Puerto Rico. As traffic crashes are certainly an important public health and safety issue, and considering the challenges that current social issues and the pandemic have brought before us, we could not think of a more appropriate keynote speaker to close our 2021 Lifesavers Conference. Please welcome Dr. Jewel Mullen.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's an honor for me, and I come to you with humility and want to be upfront that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the message that I wanted to share. And so I'm here inspired by the entire program that you've had this week, and informed by a lot of the work I've done inside and outside of government. Sometimes I talk about myself as being a big kid. So perhaps when I think about lifesavers and one's ability to move safely through life and communities, safe routes to school is one of the first things that comes to mind, which is one reason that I entitled this talk, Safe Routes for Everyone and for a Lifetime. And I want to, without sounding like a cliche, thank all of you for the work that you do every day on behalf of society. It strikes me that we are now 1 year and 3 days post the death of Breonna Taylor. And I mention that because some of the themes that I'm going to touch on today harken back to a lot of what we have dealt with as a country and across the world over the past year in the collision of COVID and racial injustice and social inequality in this country. But I also wanted to mention Breonna Taylor, knowing that hearing her name might make some people bristle and wonder what I might say next, but also to remind you that she was a lifesaver. So let's go on to the next slide. Yep, I'm a doctor. You heard my bio. I'm sorry it was so long. And I am at the right conference. For everything that you have heard about me, I come to you also saying, there's so much that I want to talk to you about. I promise to stay on time as I share perspectives on safety, health, equity, and society from the roads that I've traveled. And as we go on to the next slide, I want to start with where I grew up. New Rochelle, New York, as a kid in the 60s, growing up in my community, public housing, still lovingly known as City Park by childhood friends from across New Rochelle that I'm still in connection with now. City Park is known in New Rochelle as being a place different from some of what some people know New Rochelle to be as a lovely bedroom community of New York City. But this development was constructed in the late 40s for World War II vets, civil servants, and was largely, when we were living there, moving in, Black and white, pretty diverse, with a lot of Italian and Irish neighbors alongside my African-American neighbors. We walked to our neighborhood school. We walked home for lunch. We played in the circle. You see the neatness, the order. Families watched out for one another. And as we did our walks back and forth to school, things happened, such as the day one of my playmates was attacked by a German Shepherd that had gotten through the fence of a nearby neighborhood in somebody's suburban house, where one of our playmates, taking a route that was also associated with playing hide and seek on the way home, hid in a refrigerator, because there were at that point no zoning requirements that doors be taken off of refrigerators. So disappeared on the way home from school and couldn't be found for days until somebody found him suffocated inside the refrigerator. Where the path that we walked to school was adjacent to a brook that wasn't fenced and that flooded whenever it rained heavily, so that parents always warned us to be careful not to try to cross the brook, which we did when the water was shallow, and walked with us to make sure nobody would drown. And where, when some of the really horrible events happened with children, because of the sense of community cohesion, including with my parents, my father, who was a civil servant and happened to be an auxiliary policeman and life member of the National Rifle Association gun owner, and another family member whose father was a police officer, really pushed the city to make sure that we had more safety. And that was important at that time for all of our well-being. And if we go on to the next slide, I can remind you that when I said New Rochelle, some of you might have thought of this New Rochelle as seen on TV, the home of Rob and Laura Petrie from the Dick Van Dyke's show. Well, this was also my extended neighborhood and the neighborhood where a lot of my friends came from, but a very different kind of community where some of the hazards that I just described for my classmates and me certainly were not the ones that my classmates from the other side of the school had to experience. And along with that, in doing things like walking from junior high school through neighborhoods like this, home to City Park, I still remember the day that someone followed me as I was walking home after spending extra time in the library. An older, and who knows, I was only 14, so who knows how much older that person was, white man trying to get me to get into his car as I kept trying to figure out, whether or not I needed to run to someone's house for safety. There were no phone booths along the way, and I was just trying to walk home safely after spending extra time at school studying. And I mentioned that story not because any physical harm came to me, but I recall going home, telling my mother about the incident and having her call the police, knowing, one, how dangerous that was for me, how traumatizing it was for me, and that there was somebody out there that someone needed to find to protect others. And remembering the white police officer who came to our home, where we also thought, well, my father's an auxiliary police officer, so maybe we even had a little bit more social capital. And having the officer ask me to describe the driver, and recalling then in the 60s when there was so much social unrest in the US, how I could say to a police officer comfortably, it was a white man who was following me, worried that the officer would be angry that I said it was a white person, worrying whether or not he was going to take me seriously. And as we have seen in events that have happened across the country, if something had happened to me, worrying whether or not anybody would have even cared in the long run. And it would have mattered as much as if this had been something that had occurred with one of my classmates from this side of town. And we can go on to the next slide. So that being said, when I think about being a doctor and when I think about what people do in public safety, including traffic safety, I still go back to the similarities that we have as professions. Because in the same way that we could call the police because we trusted them and had high opinions of them, people come to me and my colleagues as doctors still having a reasonable amount of trust for our sense of honesty and ethics. And doctors have had to be sobered for many years now that nurses are much more trusted than we are. But if you look at a poll, Gallup from just last year, doctors still have a pretty high rating for honesty. And for police officers, it's in the middle, but I'm going to show you some other slides. We can go on. In another survey, looking at the view of honesty and ethical standards of professions, we see medical doctors in general are deemed to have very high or high standards. And then police officers as well, looking that people see them as having very high or high, not as high, but only 14% of those surveyed rated them as having low standards. And I think that's important. I think that's important, especially in the conversations and debates that we've had over the past year, to really remember that the conversations are about improving society and don't need to be about defending our professions and the roles that we play in society. So let's go on. And another thing that we share as Lifesavers docs and what you do is that the work that we do is very much influenced by people's economics, their social and community context, neighborhood and built environment, education, quality of the services we provide, and in my case, access to care and quality. Sometimes in your case, in access to care and quality too, if we think about things like injuries and then ambulance response times. And so when public health colleagues of mine have talked about thinking about health in all policies or all policies for health, what I try to encourage in conversations is the recognition that all of us do work that impacts the health and well-being of others. And our ability to do that work is oftentimes very influenced by things that are not in our immediate control. We don't control the immediate environment and built environment. We don't control economic stability, but our work unfolds in the context of things like that. And we have voice and experience that helps us inform policy and policymakers to create better contexts for everyone's well-being. We can go on to the next slide. And if we do that, that puts us in a better position to advance health equity, assuring that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. I'm talking health equity as a public health person. Health equity is very important to what you do in transportation safety. Health equity requires removing obstacles to health, poverty, discrimination, powerlessness, and lack of access to goods, quality education, housing, safe environments, and healthcare. Removing those obstacles with the goal of ultimately eliminating the disparities in health or well-being and those social determinants that more commonly affect people who are excluded, marginalized, discriminated against. And while many of you will hear this conversation as being focused a lot on race and ethnicity, I remind everyone that that word, everyone, is also who we're talking about when we discuss fair and just opportunity. Next slide. And a way to conceptualize the different layers of impact for equitable or fair or just opportunity, or inequitable, unfair access to opportunity can be thought through in this model around how different influences actually create, perpetuate, drive inequities or the ability to be as health or well for individuals and their communities. So if we think of our vision, hopefully a shared vision for having healthier, more equitable communities, then if we look at transportation and the social environment and public safety all as areas in which inequities can drive unequal outcomes and disparities. And I deliberately did not focus this talk on data that you have probably heard and presentations similar to what you've received through the course of this conference that really pull back the curtain on what those injustices are. So let's go on to the next slide instead. Focusing on structural inequities, not just the things that we do, but the policies and practices in our systems, like social welfare, like our justice system, our transportation system. And many times as people think about transportation safety, I think that they automatically envision this continuum between safe transportation safety and law enforcement. There is such opportunity, as we have seen, for rehashing, recycling, reproducing bad outcomes because policies and practices are not always configured to assure that inequities are not there. Inequities are rooted in political and economic organizations, healthcare, political organizations, our policymakers, our zoning laws, the ways in which, here in Austin, Texas, where I am, we still talk about pedestrian fatalities associated with people's inability to cross I-35, the highway that was put through Austin to segregate East Austin, where Black people were actually moved from the west side of the highway to the east from the rest of and wealthier parts of town. Let's go on to the next slide. So then, assuring a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, also then, if we go to the next slide, can be seen as, well, you can go back one, what Vision Zero's commitment is, as you probably already discussed this week, is that all people should have the right to move about their communities safely. Safely because of infrastructure, and safety because of the ways in which they interact, intersect, and hopefully not collide with those in transportation safety, who once again, sometimes are seen as part of a continuum with law enforcement. Let's go on to the next slide. The Prevention Institute out of Oakland has put three recommendations forward for how to advance equity through Vision Zero, as the organization and those who work with it have acknowledged that policies sometimes inherently perpetuate inequities. And one is, the first recommendation was to develop and implement strategies that address the conditions that creates traffic safety inequities in the first place. And that can be infrastructure, and once again, that can be systems, the systems of our agencies, the ways in which we train people, and where we use legal and enforcement mechanisms as opposed to mechanisms to encourage more safe behavior and mitigate human error or failure. Number two, to engage a diverse range of partners within and outside of government and start with community members in defining solutions that create safer traffic conditions. The notion of creating systems and policies that are informed by the people who have to live with them and that are informed by the people who might call us out when there are harmful intended consequences of those potential policies, at the same time that they can call out where there can be harmful unintended consequences before the policy is finalized and implemented, and then we learn after the fact that they were inequitable. And three, to get and use data that gets at equity that will create safer traffic conditions. And I'll say more about that. We can go on to the next slide. Along with that, then, one of the things that, one of the reasons I included this slide on communication is that sometimes there's a lot that we do inside of our disciplines where we talk to one another and people don't know. They don't know, we don't talk with them, or we, in all our good intentions, don't always communicate what it is we are working on. So equity in communication with Vision Zero includes making sure that the agencies that are going to be creating and enforcing policies across a municipality, for example, or state government, are working together. Similarly, though, even from my time in the federal government, I know from doing work with the Department of Transportation and groups like the Coordinating Council for Access and Mobility, how important it was for all of us who had an interest in people's mobility and their well-being to be in the same conversations around policies for them. To make sure we're communicating with the right kinds of language and the right words, the words that bring people in and don't start with the power dynamics or victim perpetrator kinds of innuendo. Emphasizing safety in a way that talks about design, not just people, and that talks about the design of roads that also can contribute to errors that occur. Assuring that the conversation includes need for equitable law enforcement, because once again, I think that many communities see those who work in safety as being those who are enforcers, and much of, if we consider something that I didn't bring, which could be a billboard of the numbers of Black and other minoritized men and women who have been victims of law enforcement after what was supposedly an intervention intended to promote safety, where somebody ended up dead, then it's really, really important for the public to also believe that they are contributing to equitable safety and equitable law enforcement, and not using law enforcement as the hammer to make sure safety occurs. meaningful community engagement, and making sure the right messengers bring the right messages to communities are all part of equity and communication. Let's go on to the next slide. And as easy as all that sounds, and for everything that I have said, like so many other things in life, you talked about COVID this week, you talked about vaccinations. We've heard a whole lot about vaccine hesitancy among racial and ethnic minority groups, especially among African Americans. At the same time that people are starting to pay more attention now, even Dr. Fauci this week, to vaccine hesitancy among people who identify as Republicans. So if we're willing to look at Black-white issues, but also understand things are more complicated than just Black and white, then a slide like this one is helpful to really show us how complex the world of Lifesavers, your world, my world as a physician, the public and politics can be. Because if you look here just at the top line for who gets a very high or high honesty rating, considered to have high ethical standards, police officers among 79% of Republicans rank highly. Democrats only 36%, a 43% spread. Doctors, 70% among Republicans, 84% among Democrats. This is another Gallup poll from just late last year, a 14% spread. And so when people say to me, how can you work in an academic health center? I say, there's politics in everything. And when people say, how can you work in politics? I can say, there's politics in everything. And this is a really good example of how we, as we think about messengers, work, and the way our work is perceived by others, understand that sometimes it's not work, but ideology or political philosophy that also drives how people see us. But in driving how people see us and our work and the importance, sometimes that also leads in partisan ways to the perpetuation of or thinking up some new policies that can be really harmful or damning to the good intentions of just really wanting to serve the public. We can go on to the next slide. And we've seen so many lessons for us in the past year, as COVID has reminded us that disparities are real. I don't need to show you the data. As people who have said things such as, I am not my pre-existing conditions, or don't blame me as an essential worker for being at higher risk for COVID. I didn't even get PPE and I can't protect myself or stay home. People experiencing health disparities did not create the systems responsible for them. It's really important for us to understand how our roles and race interact and influence how other people see us. And that's so key. We have such a political and racial divide in this country that in the same way that I, as an African-American woman, or a number of students I teach or others just in society have to stop and say, did that happen to me because I am this? And you fill in the category. As somebody who works in safety or law enforcement, you can ask yourself the same question. In the same way that I, as an adolescent who was just frightened and wanted somebody to make me feel safe after a man tried to get me in his car coming home from school, had to figure out how to have a conversation where I could believe that an officer saw me as a vulnerable teenager. At the same time that if he just came in actually worried about me as a vulnerable teenager, I was going through in my mind, is he even going to take me seriously? Those kind of mental dynamics that don't get articulated are the realities of the world we live in because of our inability still to reconcile race in this country. And the fact that what we think doesn't always come through in what we say. And we also should consider that we are all called to work in safe service to the safety and the health of society. And in doing that, we have to drive equitable systems and actions that demonstrate that all people matter equally. It is really time for us to not have to bristle at the notion that any group, including Black lives, that any group that society has shown is marginalized and discriminated against still should have to be asked to be, or should have to ask one and society to show their health and well-being is important as anyone else's. That's an invitation for us to be a better society. That's not an invitation for revolution or fighting words. And it's really important for us to consider how we can hear that and receive that and work towards that. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time that we can hear the word racism and understand what it means in terms of oppression, acknowledge that it still exists, and that from a United States perspective, the privileged group through which we define racist practice and policy is white people. And to hear that and to acknowledge that it does manifest across systems, institutions, and organizations. There may be some of you who are saying, oh, not this again, at the same time that I can probably go to a meeting in the next day with some of my medical colleagues and show a slide like this and have them say, oh, not this again too, even though many in the medical community are still up in arms because the editor of a major medical journal just tweeted a couple of weeks ago that doctors can't be racist. And as we think about systems and policies and correcting them, to consider how we avoid collision courses. I don't know how many people have seen the bill that passed out of committee in the Kentucky Senate, proposing that it should be a crime if people taunt police. I call it a collision course. And I ask you whether or not a bill like this, even for you, who might consider a seatbelt enforcement, helmet enforcement, speeding, would wonder if someone who is stopped has an encounter with a police officer, who then, if a bill like this becomes law, if the officer feels that the driver accosts, insults, taunts, or challenges them, or uses offensive or derisive language, or gestures, or physical contact, the officer or anyone who feels as a reasonable or prudent person could have them charged with a Class B misdemeanor. I call that a collision course. I call that the direction that we don't want to go in. And I question whether or not that actually makes anybody's job easier when you have to decide what you do. And the reason I mention it is because you might hear it as a political statement, but I also put it out there as an opportunity to say, we work in these fields, and we don't think this is a policy that you ought to consider without considering all of these potential consequences. And being able to even think about the dynamics at play in a situation where someone has an encounter around safety, to know that one way for us to all do better is to understand empathy and to really think about our own development of deeper empathy, being aware, sensitive to, and really trying to sort of walk in the shoes of somebody else It's such an important concept, to really try to see things through the experience that someone else has had through life can take us a long way in being able to work better with communities and improve our systems. And if we go on to the next slide, to be able to do that along with cultural humility, engaging really actively and in a committed way with people, with communities, with colleagues, to really understand culture, where they're coming from, how they see things, in a dynamic process where we are getting better at seeing and understanding where someone else is coming from in their experience, can inform us so much in the work in which we do. We can go on to the next slide. And if we can do that, we can do an even bigger job of promoting institutional humility and systems change. Doctors, like the editor who said, doctors can't be racists. We all need to be able to look inside ourselves and inside of our systems and see where they're flawed. And so it's really important to be open to and explore the possibility that there's something fundamentally wrong with systems whose actions or implementation result in harm. Especially when the harm is of disproportionate danger to groups that have been historically and systematically discriminated against. And one way to really own that that's happening is to collect complete, accurate data, to analyze it, disaggregate it by race and other populations of interest, to assess that harm, to be transparent, open about it, not just internally, but externally, and take action based on the data. And again, to engage communities in developing the policies and ways forward that those data tell us we ought to focus on. We can go on to the next slide. And in doing so, to really use those data and own what's happening, we have to avoid the complicity of ignorance, denial, and inaction. We can't just look the other way. We can't tell somebody their experience. We can't deny someone else's narrative about how they are experiencing something. And failure to act might not just seem like complicity. In the eyes of some people, it may seem like conspiracy. I don't think that's what a safety system is set up to be. Let's move on to the next slide. So, as I have thought about so many events of the past year, I've said to myself, for as many times as I've heard names like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, I haven't so much heard Rodney King's name. But when it comes to unsafe driving and law enforcement, maybe it's my age that he's still the first person I think of. But it might also be because the way in which I've always approached my work is to try to bring people together. And I've noticed over time when I would, in a somewhat glib, but hopefully not in a way that an officer would hear me as being snide or disrespectful, if I were in Kentucky and that bill passed into law, I have oftentimes proposed to people that I'm just from the can't we all get along school, with the notion that what I was really trying to do is bring people together. And it struck me how often people would hear that term, that phrase, and bristle. I would say, I'm from the Rodney King, can't we all get along school? Well, a lot of people remember that can we all get along quote. A few days ago, I went back and I listened to the press conference from 1991, because I wondered what else he had said. And the ending of the sentence was, can we get along and stop making it horrible for the older people and the kids? And I thought it was worth putting that here as we once again thinking about the safe routes that people have to course and need to be able to course, not just to school, but across a lifetime. Because, you know, maybe it would be helpful to us now to use all of what Rodney King said in reminding us that all of society needs to be better in the systems in which we are working to hopefully serve them equitably. It's been 30 years since he said those words, and we still have a long way to go. We can go on to the next slide. It's been interesting, you know, the coincidence for me in doing this talk in part was, it almost feels like all roads somehow were coursing through Louisville as I started talking about Breonna Taylor, my father, the World War II vet who was also a life member of the NRA, an auxiliary police officer, who was born and grew up in segregated Louisville, Kentucky. To now think about a year post the Breonna Taylor associated police violence in Louisville, to have a bill being passed that might take us even more in the wrong direction of learning how we de-escalate and how we combine safety and law enforcement and separate them where we need to, and help the public see the intention around doing that. At the same time that we're willing to look at proposed policies and ask ourselves, who are they intended to hurt or suppress? And at the same time that we do work within systems, knowing the work that we need to do ourselves to be better creators of better systems for the public. So I'm going to end with these two quotes, one from the Chicago Commission on Race Relations and one from Cornel West. I mentioned just a little bit of history, mostly Rodney King, but the past is of value only as it aids in understanding the present, and an understanding of the facts of the problem is the first step towards solution. Okay, not denial, taking things head on, using data, working together to solve, and still continuing to believe along the way that we all do this because of our service, because we care, and that we're committed to, as you have been throughout this conference, to reimagine what you do, to remake the systems, and to have that work come through as service to the better society that we really all need. I appreciate your listening to me today. I know when I started this talk, I knew that some people would probably think they agree, and others would say they wouldn't, and others might think I didn't hit hard enough on issues around race. And if you're still listening and thinking any of those things, then at least I'm glad you're still listening. And if so, for whatever you're thinking, I hope I'm helping you think a little bit deeper, both about your own role and the roles that you play when you go back into your workday to make us have safer systems, more equitable systems for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mullen. We had no doubt that you were indeed at the right conference, and we thank you for sharing your expertise and experiences with us. You highlighted the importance of equity considerations and why it makes sense that the U.S. Department of Transportation under this administration is prioritizing equity in infrastructure, in investing in jobs, and in health and safety. As we in the Lifesavers community work to improve roadway safety, it is important to keep this in mind and make sure we are connecting with all people in our communities and ensuring safe routes for everyone.
Thank you.
There are 48 young people joining us as attendees today, our 2021 Traffic Safety Scholars. These undergraduate and graduate students from colleges and universities throughout the United States and abroad immerse themselves in the virtual Lifesavers experience to gain knowledge and opportunities to further their future careers as traffic safety professionals. I would like to once again, on behalf of the Lifesavers Planning Committee, extend our congratulations to the Traffic Safety Scholar Class of 2021. Remember, everyone, these amazing young people are looking for jobs or internship opportunities, so please reach out to them. They are featured on the Traffic Safety Scholars page of the Lifesavers website, on social media platforms, and in the lobby on the conference platform. They are the future of traffic safety. It is now time to say thank you to our host state, California, and virtually pass the safety vest to our 2022 host, Illinois. Lifesavers will once again return to Chicago, March 13th to 15th, 2022 at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. So mark your calendars. Here to do the honors are Barbara Rooney, Director of the California Office of Traffic Safety, and Cynthia Waters, Bureau Chief of the Illinois Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Kristen. And wow, Dr. Mullen, what an amazing and powerful message and just a great way to close this conference. Thank you so much. You certainly have me thinking. On behalf of California, I want to thank all of you for being part of the 2021 Virtual Lifesavers Conference. And I certainly hope you didn't get a sunburn while virtually enjoying our beautiful California sunshine. While we all wish we would have met in person in Long Beach, it has been our honor to host this event virtually. We hope you took away from this conference new and innovative approaches to tackling our nation's worst traffic safety problems, that you will put what you've learned to use and take back to your states and your communities a renewed commitment and sense of urgency in your efforts to prevent crashes and save lives. But before we close and I officially pass the safety vest to Illinois, I'd like to thank the people who worked tirelessly to ensure this first virtual event was a huge success. A big thank you to the Lifesavers Planning Committee, my staff at the Office of Traffic Safety, our volunteers from the California Highway Patrol and the California Department of Transportation. I'd like to also extend a special thank you to Stephanie Spade and Cynthia Carter of my staff for their efforts, and to Jaime Garza from the California Department of Motor Vehicles for serving as our virtual conference guide. You all contributed so much of your time and talent, and we thank you. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to pass the official safety vest to Cynthia Waters, Bureau Chief of the Illinois Department of Transportation.
We look forward to receiving that vest as it safely travels across the states. And we look forward to seeing everyone in 2022 at the Lifesavers Conference in Chicago. I'm Cynthia Waters, the Bureau Chief of Safety Programs at the Illinois Department of Transportation. And as our lives slowly begin to go back to normal, we have a lot for you to see and learn next year at the conference. Transportation is Illinois, and Illinois is transportation. We are proud to serve as the North American Transportation Hub, a distinction that we would like to strengthen under the leadership of Governor J.B. Pritzker and the Secretary of Transportation, Omer Osman. Illinois is home to the third largest infrastructure and bridge system, the second largest transit system, the world's busiest airport, O'Hare International. We are the only state where the Class 1 railroads operate. We are also bordered by rivers, and we are the only connection between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. Now add that all up, and there's no better place to have a transportation conference than right here in Illinois in the great city of Chicago. With a system as rich in infrastructure as ours, there's a great deal of responsibility on safety. We at IDOT are very proud of all the work we have done to keep our transportation network as safe as possible on both the behavioral and the engineering sides. We have a long history of award-winning safety campaigns. We have a robust partnership with law enforcement, public health, and community organizations to help share and amplify our safety measures. We have led efforts to reach out to the public to ensure that they have the tools to keep themselves as well as others safe on our roadways. We've integrated our safety engineering efforts to help guide our most crucial planning and programming decisions. And as we all know, there's a lot more to do to keep our roads safe and keep our people safe. And the only acceptable number of fatalities on our roadways is 0. So when you come to Illinois, I think you will see that we don't just take transportation as a way to move safety and goods. It's in everything we do, and we're proud to show it off. Chicago is home to the EI transit system, which dates back to the 19th century and is considered one of the 7 wonders of Chicago. It is home to the Chicago River, which engineers miraculously changed the flow over 100 years ago. And every spring they dye it green in honor of St. Patrick's Day. So hopefully next year when you're here, you'll get to see that. The city prides itself on the beautiful lakefront of Lake Michigan, the iconic Lakeshore Drive, Millennium Park, the Bean, and of course, Navy Pier, one of the top destinations for people to visit. These are just a few of the things you'll get to see and do next year in Chicago. So mark your calendars for March 13th through the 15th and come join us. Now here's a video for a little bit of what you'll get to do and see next year. And thank you.
Thank you, Barbara and Cynthia. I know I speak for everyone on the Lifesavers Planning Committee, as well as all of you when I say thank you to California and the California Office of Traffic Safety staff and volunteers for all of the time and energy you've invested to make this conference successful. Please join me in a round of applause for our host state of California. We look forward to seeing all of you in Chicago next March. In the meantime, please be on the lookout for an email from Lifesavers asking for your feedback on this year's first ever virtual conference. There is also a link in the platform to the final conference evaluation. The plenaries and workshops will be available on the platform for the next 45 days post-conference for on-demand viewing by registered attendees. Be sure to check out our social media pages for up-to-date information on all things Lifesavers. See you in Chicago. Be well.